So just go for it.
Great. Thanks, Graham. Hopefully we're all back from our rooms, and we're going to crack on. I've been asked by Graham to speak on how we engage with the science and how we weight our own policy opinions in the light of that. And I have to say it's a privilege to be able to speak on this, but I also feel somewhat daunted. I've been asking myself over the last week why I'm speaking on this. Maybe you are asking the same question. I guess one of the reasons might be that I have actually spoken out quite publicly on social media about some of my opinions on these matters. And people have commented on that, sometimes positively, sometimes less positively. But I guess that's one of the reasons why I might have been asked to speak on this. Now, I have to say right at the outset that because I'm an evangelist and apologist, it probably makes it a bit easier for me to do that than it might do if you're, for instance, a local pastor. I'm not employed by any one organisation, although I work with many organisations and churches, so it gives me a certain freedom to be able to speak in a way that maybe others don't have. And I guess also perhaps being an evangelist, used to speaking in universities, I'm used to being in the minority opinion on matters, and I'm used to challenging sometimes the consensus of ideas around. But I guess the question is, how do we go about weighing up the scientific discussion, which we've heard a little bit about from Peter? How do we respond to that ourselves? In the early days of the pandemic, the government repeatedly used this expression that they were following the science. And I guess some people had this kind of naive view, perhaps, that there was therefore just one unified scientific opinion on everything. Now, of course, there are certain things that pretty much everyone does agree with. We do know that this is a highly infectious disease, that is a virus that has very real dangers, particularly to the elderly and to those with other pre-existing medical conditions. But there's also a real divergence of opinion, isn't there, as we've heard? And I guess particularly on two issues. Firstly, on how serious this is, and then secondly, in terms of what our response to it should be. And so on those two issues, I think there are real divergence. And I guess we've become increasingly aware of that over perhaps the last few months as they have gained more publicity. I guess one view, the majority view, we might say, or the conservative view, as Peter talks about it, is the idea that without strong intervention, the impact of the spread of COVID would be catastrophic, overwhelming our health service, leading to a seriously higher number of deaths in our countries, and therefore restrictions and lockdowns are necessary to control or suppress the virus until a vaccine is available. And that's one view. I guess there's another view that's people are now increasingly aware of that challenges that. So we might call that the kind of dissenting view. People like Carl Hennigan or Sunetra Gupta from Oxford University have had quite profile in talking about it. And I guess they're basically saying that maybe it's not as bad as some people would make out, so that herd immunity might be possible sooner than we would expect, and that therefore we should be able to have some degree of normality whilst at the same time protecting those who are in a more vulnerable category. And as Peter helpfully explained, that view has been summed up in the Great Barrington Declaration, which came out about 3 weeks ago now. And there's been a response to that by those who hold a more conservative view in the John Snow memorandum. So as we look at these kind of divergent views, I guess the question is, how do we respond to that? So I guess there are three potential problems that I see that we could fall into. The first is that it's actually quite confusing, isn't it? Anyone who's looked into the debate realizes that there are lots of arguments both ways. And I find arguments on both sides persuasive, but I also find arguments on both sides cause me to doubt. So, for instance, I am suspicious of the claim that the initial lockdown in Britain actually led to the saving of 500,000 lives, given that actually globally we've only just passed 1 million deaths. So I think that might have been overstating the case. But I'm also suspicious of those who have spent the summer saying there would be no second wave, because I think even taking into account the fact that we are doing increased testing, there does seem to be an increase in cases in many countries across Europe, including our own. So it's confusing. That's the first problem. The second problem, as we've mentioned, is it can become partisan, and people's opinions can divide down political lines. Although I would want to push back and say that is not always the case. Some of my friends who are particular, I guess we could say lockdown skeptics, are those that would hold to generally left-wing political opinions. So it's not always the case that it's partisan. But thirdly, and I think most significantly, I and I guess many of us are not scientists. So what rights do we have to speak into any of these kind of discussions? Shouldn't we just keep out of it and let the experts discuss? I was struck by a tweet by Piers Morgan that you might have seen just a few days ago. He said, "Memo to all the millions of amateur epidemiologists on here. None of you know what you're talking about. Even the world's best epidemiologists disagree when it comes to how best to tackle COVID. So stop being so self-righteously certain you know nothing." Which I thought was a bit rich coming from someone who has spent the last few weeks in public being very, very certain about his opinions on the matter. Apparently, you can only be certain if you agree with him. But it makes a point, doesn't it? Which many people will make towards us. Maybe they've suggested to you, why should we speak at all on this matter if we're not experts in the field? And as I was thinking about that, it reminded me of a conversation I had with John Lennox a number of years ago. When I started speaking in universities, doing university mission weeks, I was often asked to speak on the topic of science and faith. And I remember speaking to John and saying, "John, as a non-scientist, is it right for me to speak on that subject? Shouldn't I leave it to people like you who are experts, who understand the science better than I do?" And I'll never forget John's response. John said, "It's absolutely right that you should speak on it." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because actually the debate is not so much always between the science, but it's between the presuppositions and the worldviews that lie behind the science. And you can engage with those." I found that really, really helpful, because I realized quite quickly that there are obviously plenty of Christians who are scientists who believe in God, and there were plenty of atheists who were also scientists and didn't believe in God. And it wasn't that one group had access to scientific information that the others didn't, but their worldview, their presuppositions affected how they weighed up the science and the scientific arguments on different matters. And I think to an extent, the same thing might be true here. We need to ask, what are the presuppositions, particularly in Western society, that affect the way we view these discussions? And how can we speak into those presuppositions? And I just want to suggest two big presuppositions that I think we can see in our society, and then think about how we could challenge them. I guess the first is this: the presupposition is this: the expectation that life can be totally safe and risk-free. Okay, the expectation that life can be totally safe and risk-free. I think we live in a society that increasingly has valued physical health almost to the exclusion of other aspects of life. And there's a danger, isn't there? Because we know that we live in a fallen world as Christians. Therefore, life will never be totally safe, and we can never eliminate all risk. And the best we can hope for is actually a management of those risks. And I worry that an obsession in our society in trying to remove the risk of COVID has actually blinded us to some of the other very real risks that are out there. I think this was highlighted last week when the University of York instructed students, if they were tested positive for COVID, to stay behind in the event of a fire alarm, so allow other people to leave the building first. That's incredible, isn't it? So they're basically saying it's okay if you die in a fire, as long as you don't pass on COVID to other people. Now you might say, well, that's kind of an isolated extreme example. That's certainly not the policy of most universities. But actually I'd say it might be reflective of a more general trend. As we've heard, there's potentially 20 to 50,000 excess cancer deaths that are going to happen in the UK due to failure of diagnosis or delayed treatments. Think of the massive cost that, for instance, the government furlough scheme has been. Every 4 days, we were paying out the equivalent of a brand new NHS hospital during the scheme. And we can think about the emotional and the mental cost of it. And then, of course, as Christians, we're aware also of the spiritual risk involved. You know, if we believe that the Bible is true, we shouldn't be surprised to expect that not being able to meet together and do things the Bible tells us to do will have a detrimental spiritual effect upon the church. So that's why I think it's really important that the government isn't led by the science, actually. The government needs to be influenced or informed by the science, but it's got to make decisions based on a whole broad range of issues, not just how do we control and suppress a virus. It's already been quoted, I think, in the chat today. But C.S. Lewis, I think, was quite incredibly prophetic when he talked about this. He said, there will become a day when politicians will increasingly rely on the advice of scientists, till in the end, the politicians proper become merely the scientists' puppets. Now, I dread specialists in power because they are specialists speaking outside their special subjects. Let scientists tell us about sciences, but government involves questions about the good for man and justice, and what things are worth having at what price. And on these, a scientific training gives a man's opinion no added value. So we need to challenge the presupposition that says we can be completely safe. We can't. We have at best the opportunity to manage risks, and we've got to look at the full gamut, the full picture of what's involved. But the second presupposition that I think we need to challenge is this unbridled confidence that we have in Western society in science, but also an accompanying, petrifying, paralyzing fear of death that we have in Western society today. I think this was really highlighted by an article that I read in The Guardian back in April, in the early stages of the pandemic, by Yuval Noah Harari. Some of you may have heard of him. He wrote the book Sapiens, Homo Deus. He's an atheist Israeli historian. And the headline said this: will coronavirus change our society's attitude towards death? And then right underneath his response, quite the opposite. And I thought he was really putting his finger on where I fear Western society is at when he said this. For scientists, death isn't a divine decree. It's merely a technical problem. Humans die not because God said so, but because of some technical glitch. The heart stops pumping blood, cancer destroys the liver, viruses multiply in the lungs, and science believes that every technical problem has a technical solution. We don't need to wait for Christ's second coming in order to overcome death. A couple of scientists in a lab can do it. True, at present, we cannot solve all technical problems, he says, but we're working on them. The best human minds no longer spend their time trying to give meaning to death. Instead, they are busy extending life. Now, I think actually he sums up many people in our society's attitude towards science, which is science can basically solve every problem and bring solutions to every difficulty that we face. It's not so much science, but scientism. It's an extension of science beyond its realm. I think there's a real danger in that, isn't there? Have we put too much faith in science to be able to sort out all of our problems? I guess one practical outworking of this is, are we basically prepared to live with restrictions and lockdown until a vaccine arrives? Now, if a vaccine arrives in the next couple of months, then we might say that decision was vindicated. But what if it doesn't arrive for 6 months, a year, 5 years, or 18 years, as Boris potentially hinted at last week in Parliament? What would we do in that situation? My fear is that in trying to eliminate death, we've actually forgotten how to live. I was struck by Jesus' words: those who want to save their lives will lose them. And I worry that we're spending so long trying to save our lives from this particular illness that actually we're losing what really makes life worth living. So again, I want to say we can challenge the presupposition, the presupposition that says we can expect life to be 100% safe. It isn't. And challenge the presupposition that says that science can solve all of our problems. It can't. I think if you want a really good example of how that can be challenged, just think about the letter that many signed and was sent to the leaders of our countries over the last month ago, I think. And also, if you haven't seen it, look at Ian Paul's interview on Sky News about that letter, which I thought was a fantastic example of how to speak into some of those presuppositions. Now, why should we speak on this? Why do I think it's important? Well, I'll give you 3 reasons. Firstly, quickly, because we live in a democracy, and therefore I can exercise my voice in light of what is going on. We have a government that seems particularly worried about public opinion. And so if exercising my voice can help in some small way to shape public opinion, then I believe that's a good thing. And if that can help influence government policy, then potentially that is also a good thing. And secondly, because I'm really concerned for Christians who are living in a great sense of fear. The Bible says we need to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, not conformed by the pattern of this world. And I believe that there are too many Christians who have become too fearful because their only diet has basically been essentially the nightly news, and are living in fear because of that. Actually, it's interesting. I've often found in my conversations with people that people's fear of COVID is inversely proportional to their risk of dying of it. So actually, I know lots of young people who have very little risk of COVID and yet have lived in great fear because of it over the last few months. It's interesting, the government don't plan to vaccinate young people under the age of 50 because actually the risks of vaccination are currently greater than the risks of COVID to younger people who don't have underlying health conditions. And a third reason why I think it's important to speak about this is because actually I think it's part of our witness. I was struck by an interview that Glenn Scrivener, the evangelist, did with Tom Holland, the historian, just about a week ago. If you haven't seen it, it's well worth watching. Tom Holland's very sympathetic to Christian faith, but at the same time, he says he's incredibly disappointed by the response of the church to the current pandemic. He says his impression of the church has been that it simply reiterated public health advice and hasn't had anything else to say into what is going on. And I wonder whether there's a challenge there that we need to hear. Do we need to regain a prophetic voice as the church to speak into what is happening? Do we need to challenge our society about our own frailties, our own mortality? Do we need to proclaim more clearly the hope of Jesus in the face of death and think about what that means for us? Do we need to talk about what is the purpose of life? Is life's purpose simply summed up in increasing our heartbeats or actually in enlarging our hearts? So lastly, before we go to questions, how should we do this? How do we go about speaking about these issues? Let me just give you 3 pieces of advice. Firstly, be humble. Let's be careful not to speak dogmatically on issues that there is a great degree of uncertainty on. We need to acknowledge that we might be wrong, and that's always a good thing to do when we speak about certain things. We could do a great deal of harm to our witness if we spoke with as much certainty on disputed scientific issues as we do about the gospel and the resurrection of Christ. So we need to make sure that we're careful there. Secondly, I think we need to be really generous. Let's assume the best of those with whom we disagree when it comes to the scientific discussion. Let's acknowledge that they have good reasons for thinking the way that they do, and let's hope that they might also think the best of us as we have these discussions. That would help a lot of our discussions, particularly on social media. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, let's speak about Jesus. Let's use what is going on as a bridge to communicating the good news of the gospel. In the early days of the pandemic, I was asked by numerous churches and Christian unions to speak evangelistically on basically why did God allow this pandemic, which is a great thing to do when everyone was thinking particularly about coronavirus. I would suggest now a talk about coronavirus, or with coronavirus in the title, would be a real turn-off because people are sick of it. But actually, there are so many existential questions and presuppositions that this has raised in our society that we can speak into. So as people have realized the uncertainty of their lives, we want to talk about the true foundation which can remain secure in the midst of everything going on. As people realize that we cannot be 100% safe, let's proclaim the one in whom we can find utter security and eternal safety. As we realize our human limitations and the limitations of science, let's point people ultimately to God, who holds everything in his hands. As we think about our own mortality, let's think about the one who conquered death. And as we question our purpose in life, let's point people to life that can be found in abundance in Jesus now and in the age to come. Let's point people towards Jesus, and let's use this as a bridge to speak into it and take the opportunity. Dave.
Thank you, Michael. So you've talked there about the challenge of speaking as a Christian, often where you may be challenging the consensus, and sometimes where that means you're even disagreeing with other Christians' perceptions on the consensus. Have you got any thoughts on how we can model disagreeing well, both with consensus secular views and with each other, in a way that promotes the gospel and points people to Christ?
Yeah, so I think firstly, in terms of how do we challenge stuff, I think asking questions is always a really good way to do that. So as you kind of find out things that would maybe counter consensus arguments, to just bring those up as questions and to see how people respond, and to do that with a degree of humility as well. So as I said, it's often helpful. I've tried to do this on social media to say people may disagree with me on this, and I accept that I may be wrong, but this is how I see things, and just put it out there and allow people to have a kind of open discussion. I'm really happy to have open discussion. My frustration is when you can't even discuss it because people are assuming the worst of you and why you're thinking the way that you are. So an appeal to kind of think generously of the other side, a desire to ask questions. And I guess beneath that, as I was saying, to try and get to the presuppositions. So why might we think the way we do? I don't think it's just political. Honestly, I don't think, as I said, some of the friends that I have who would be kind of very skeptical of the current regime, or current kind of restrictions, I should say, are those that would have, you know, quite left-wing political views. So what are the other things that might be at play on this? Yeah.
Thank you. And so some questions coming in the chat. There's a question here. To what extent is the science and, I guess, scientific leaders and governments, are they usurping our God-given responsibility to subdue and control creation?
Sorry, so what's I'm just looking up to find that one again.
So it's the extent to which our responsibility to subdue and fill creation is actually taken over by science, when actually that's our responsibility, which I guess links into Matthew's talk about the purpose serving the assembly of God's people.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to, whilst I want to recognise the limits of science, I would also want to recognise the role of science within that too. So actually one of the ways that we subdue and care for creation is through science and through understanding science. So I think it's not either or, we need both. We need to listen to what scientific opinions are saying on all sorts of issues, but we also need to listen to that with a bigger picture in mind as well. And not become blinkered to other issues. So we need both ends.
Yeah. Is there a risk that we get so obsessed with digging into the scientific debate, what the epidemiologists are saying, that we actually that we lose time and energy on engaging with the gospel with people? How do we get that balance right?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, you know, there is a danger we, like that tweet suggested, we all become kind of amateur epidemiologists, and we look into that. Now, I think it's good to look into that. I think it's good to be aware of the discussions. I think it's good to be aware of our limitations and to acknowledge that we're limited in our perspective on that. I think being aware of that might help us as we engage in conversation. And so I've found that really helpful as, for instance, we've chatted with our neighbours, because people do like talking about this. You know, it's not just Christians that talk about this, everyone does in our society. You know, we have neighbours that are incredibly frustrated with what's going on, and so it's a way into conversation to be able to have an informed discussion about arguments kind of either way. So I don't want to ignore that and say, let's not talk about that, let's talk about Jesus. I can have a conversation about the science, and I can have a conversation about the different kind of arguments either way. But I can then ask the question and say, you know, why do you think we've responded this way? And I found it really helpful to say, you know, do you think actually as a society we've become so fearful of death that actually we've kind of maybe overreacted at times? And I found that quite a helpful way into conversations, as we've then had conversations about death, talking about actually my faith as a Christian, the hope that I have. So it's good to be aware of, but let's use it as a bridge.
So it's a way of knowing our way in and building the contact rather than it becoming the all-consuming thing. And I guess sort of linked in, I know you referred to Glenn's conversation with Tom Holland, and I had a conversation with Glenn about this the other day, and this is coming up a few times, I think, with the Douglas Murray article about finding a church building closed. To what extent do we see those as helpful sort of critical comments, and to what extent do we actually say, no, you've misseen who the church is, that actually if your view of who the church is these public figures, the bishops and that kind of thing, well, actually no, the local church has been engaging the gospel with people.
Yeah, and I think thanks for the question, because I think that is a helpful kind of thing to raise, which is, you know, I don't assume that Douglas Murray and Tom Holland are speaking for the entirety of the British population when they criticise the church in that way. But I think we would be naive to say that they are, you know, isolated voices. I think there are a number of people that they would probably represent in that we need to be aware of. That's what I'm saying. And I'm also aware that perhaps when they're thinking about the church, they're not thinking about the local evangelical church that you're part of. They're thinking just about, you know, what they've seen of, say, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or kind of what the church as a whole has done in response to this. So I think sometimes, you know, particularly when I was reading Douglas Murray's criticism, I was thinking, you know, I know a lot of churches for which this just isn't true, and I wish he could see them, and I wanted him to see that. But I do worry also that sometimes we have taken an overcautious response. And I also worry about what that communicates. And so if we bear in mind, to give you one example, for instance, I was having a conversation earlier in the summer about whether we should do a certain evangelistic initiative. And the pushback was, well, by meeting physically, there is a risk involved here. And my pushback was to say, yes, that there is a risk, isn't there? If we do this, that someone might catch COVID, they might go home, they might see their granny, they might die. That's real. Mm-hmm. But there's also a risk if we don't do this. And what are we communicating by being overcautious? I think we're communicating sometimes that actually physical health is the only thing that matters. I think we need to somehow communicate, yes, physical health is important. We take that seriously. God has given us physical bodies, but it's not the only thing that matters. And therefore, let's not fall into the idolatry, perhaps, of our society in that.
Okay, this is a good one here, and so it amuses me because I think you and I may have hopefully disagreed well on this in Facebook conversations. I know I'm often disagreeable, so I've disagreed with someone on this, but do we need to challenge the language of we can control the virus?
I think there is some dispute on that, and I think certainly in terms of whether people signed or didn't sign a letter that went out was partly to do with this kind of idea of like, should we be challenging that? And I guess this is one area where there is genuine disagreement. To what level do our human interventions actually affect what is going on? Mm-hmm. And I think we've got to say it does have some effect, obviously, but to what extent we can really control it, and to what extent our interventions are having an impact, and to what degree would those things happened anyway, given the kind of particular peculiarities of each country and their geographical situation, is another matter. I think we've got to be slightly agnostic on that. We don't fully know. I think there's a danger that we can kind of go to one extreme and say, nothing we would do would have any impact. That's clearly not true. But equally, I think sometimes there's a kind of sense in which every time the government does something, we say, if we hadn't done that, we'd have all been doomed. And it's like, well, how do we know? Because actually, we did do that. How do we know that that wouldn't have just happened with other kind of restrictions or without those restrictions? So I think
do you think that's part of sorry to interrupt. Do you think that's part of even a sort of a theological sort of discussion, and even a sort of a distinction in terms of our view of creation mandate and Great Commission? So in terms of, that is back to that question of subdue and fill. To what extent is that actually something that is possible and intended post the fall?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we do have a real ability to, influence and affect what happens. But as I said, in terms of the first presupposition, we can never, in a fallen world, guarantee 100% safety and remove all risks. Is it possible to get rid of COVID now? Well, I guess a lot of people would now say, and to an extent, we have to live with it. But again, there's some debate on that. I guess it's just challenging the assumption behind it, though, which is every time a problem comes, there will be a scientific solution. And the danger which, if I put so much confidence in science to be able to solve every problem, what other risks have I unwittingly walked into at the same time because I put too much confidence in this one area?
Yeah. And there are some questions about risks coming up. I guess we're moving towards the end of the session here, but questions about how we get the balance between making our own responsible decisions about risks, but also thinking about the protection and care of others, how we help people that might be in at-risk categories or feeling vulnerable to make responsible decisions so that they're not completely paralyzed by fear, but are still being responsible for themselves as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things we can really helpfully do is just help people to actually evaluate risk by letting them know what the risk is. I think studies have shown over the summer that generally in Britain, people massively overestimate the risk of COVID. So when asked how many people have died of COVID, people think it's far more in the UK than actually is. And so that means that therefore they're not able to make kind of informed decisions about risk if you think that the risk of one thing is far greater than it is. Now, it's not saying we say there is no risk, and obviously depending on your age category, depending on your kind of underlying health conditions, the risk might be higher or lower. But I think we just need to put that in balance. We had a friend of ours who was a young person, at one stage in the summer, their chance of dying of COVID was similar to being struck by lightning, or that might be one extreme, but certainly dying in a car accident. And yet they were petrified to come out of their house. And so I think we do need to help people to see that. And I think sometimes the media hasn't always helped by the way it's reported things. It's given people a distorted view of risk, which hasn't helped people to make informed decisions.
Thank you. And it's been lovely to see. I think there's been a lot of debate and conversation going on in the chat there as well that I'm sure will get fed into future sessions. Hand back. Thank you, Michael. Hand back to Graham now. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you very much, Michael, and really enjoyed that. Lots to think about. I'm pondering on it's hard to have kind of one prophetic voice. There's lots of little voices. We don't have the platform that the Archbishop of Canterbury has and so forth to be able to sort of speak on behalf of the church, whatever you think of whether he does or not, but we don't have the same platform. So it'd be great if we did in some way, but definitely lots of stuff to think about. And that domesticated view of death, that we contain death, is definitely worth challenging and thinking through. We are moving on to introduce Tim Dieppe.